Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will analyze the case of Kenneth Juedes and Cindy Schulz-Juedes. First I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Kenneth Juedes was born on March 20, 1948, and was raised in Rothschild, Wisconsin. In 1972, Kenneth earned a degree in pharmacology and started working as a pharmacist. In the mid-1970s, he purchased a 30-acre farm on Maple Road in the town of Hull, Wisconsin. He married and had 4 children, but divorced in 1998. In 2002, Kenneth met a woman named Cindy Schulz on a dating website for professionals. Like him, she had been married before. Cindy had 3 daughters. The couple became romantically involved, and Cindy moved to Kenneth's farm in Wisconsin. On October 16, 2004, they married in Las Vegas. Within a year of this wedding, Cindy ran up $75,000 in credit card debt. Starting in 2005, the couple regularly took in troubled foster children. These children were offenders who were one step away from being incarcerated. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On August 30, 2006, at about 8:20 a.m., Cindy's neighbor called 911. Cindy had driven to the neighbor's house and said that her husband was in bed unresponsive and covered in blood. After the neighbor called for help, Cindy went to another neighbor's house and repeated the same story. She failed to mention that the first neighbor had already called emergency services. The second neighbor called 911 as well. When the police arrived at Cindy's house, they found a gruesome scene. 58-year-old Kenneth Juedes had been murdered in his bed. A 20-gauge shotgun had been used to shoot him twice, once in the back and once in the chest. The police believed that he was struck in the back first, rolled over, and was shot for the second time. He was murdered during a 2-hour window starting on August 29 at 10 p.m. So he was killed between 10 and midnight. There was a long pillow next to his body. A knife was sticking through a piece of paper and into that pillow. The paper contained a single word, an expletive that rhymes with the word ditch. All the doors in the house were unlocked. There was no sign of forced entry. Here is the story that Cindy supplied to the police. On the night of August 29, Cindy had a headache. She did not want to sleep in the house because she claimed that Kenneth made too much noise. For example, he would walk around, slam doors, and his phone would ring at night. Cindy decided to sleep in a camper, which was positioned right next to the house. She took OxyContin and a sedative before going to bed for the night. Just after 8 a.m., now on August 30, Cindy woke up and had to use the bathroom. She walked into the back door of the house and noticed signs that Kenneth had not gone to work as expected. This was highly out of the ordinary for Kenneth. He was a very reliable worker. She walked to the front door of the house and saw his car in the driveway. This is when she walked upstairs to his bedroom and found him covered in blood. Cindy claimed that she tried to use the phone in the bedroom and the phone in the kitchen to call 911, but something was wrong with the phones. When she picked them up, there was a screaming sound. Even though Cindy had a cell phone, she claimed it did not work from everywhere in her house. This is why she involved her neighbors. Cindy told the police that she owned a 20-gauge shotgun. She had obtained it during the divorce from her first husband, but the weapon was missing. The police suspected that Cindy could have been involved in the murder of her husband, Kenneth, but there was no direct evidence of her guilt. The investigation continued, but no progress was made. In 2007, there was a bizarre development in the case connected to a racetrack that Kenneth co-owned called Monster Hall Raceway and Campground. This racetrack was in nearby Unity, Wisconsin. Kenneth had a disagreement with another co-owner named Randall. He believed that Randall had committed some type of fraud against him, and he even sued Randall. Ultimately, the lawsuit was dismissed. A man named Brian came forward and claimed that he was the getaway driver for the murder of Kenneth. Brian said that he drove 3 men, Gary, Jerry, and Butch, to Kenneth's house. Those men went into the house and committed the murder. Brian further claimed that Randall was the mastermind, although he wasn't there during the crime. As it turns out, one man who Brian implicated, Butch, was sort of famous. He was Butch Patrick, who played Eddie Munster in the 1960s sitcom The Munsters. Randall, Gary, Jerry, and Butch denied involvement in the murder, and the men had alibis. Eventually, Brian changed his story and denied involvement. The police concluded that none of the men were involved in the murder of Kenneth. Brian had wasted everybody's time by making false accusations. After this, the investigation into Kenneth's murder went cold. Over the years, Cindy maintained regular contact with the police. She was interviewed a few times. In 2016, a detective was assigned to the cold case. He paid a visit to Cindy's home in October 2019 and interviewed her for over 7 hours. During the interview, Cindy told the detective that the 20-gauge shotgun, the one she had received in her divorce, had been stolen a year before the murder. This was a new claim. Cindy mentioned it was missing, but she had never said anything about it being stolen. This was the only new evidence in the case, but the police felt as though they had enough to prove that Kenneth was killed by his wife. On November 27, 2019, Cindy was arrested and charged with first-degree intentional homicide and resisting or obstructing an officer. She went to trial in 2021. On October 26 of that year, she was found guilty of both charges. On June 8, 2022, Cindy was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was displeased with this severe sentence and worried about spending all those years in prison wasting away. As it turns out, her concern was unfounded. Just over a year later, on July 19, 2023, 68-year-old Cindy was found dead in her cell at the Tachita Correctional Institution. She had sustained multiple skull fractures, 34 broken ribs, bruises on her arms, chest, and abdomen, and other injuries. The only other person in her cell when she died was her cellmate, Taylor Sanchez. They had been locked in together. Ironically, Taylor was in prison for battery on an inmate and another battery charge. She had called prison staff on her intercom and told them she believed she had killed her cellmate. Other inmates heard banging, hitting, crunching, and moaning coming from the cell. Later, Taylor said that she heard voices directing her to kill Cindy. She suspected that Cindy had used her toothbrush to scrub the toilet and killed her using just her hands and feet. Taylor Sanchez was charged with first-degree intentional homicide. She pleaded not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. At the time of making this video, Taylor is working her way through the legal system after receiving a mental health evaluation. Now moving to my analysis. Cindy Schulz-Juedes maintained her innocence right up until the time she was brutally beaten to death by her cellmate. She had a few supporters who argued that the circumstantial case against her was weak. Anyone could have killed Kenneth. It did not have to be Cindy. The state, of course, disagreed. They argued that everything pointed to Cindy as the killer. This brings me to the question, was Cindy guilty of murder? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea she was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. Kenneth was mysteriously murdered in his house with a 20-gauge shotgun. Cindy had obtained a 20-gauge shotgun in her divorce. At first, she said it was missing. 13 years later, she said it was stolen a year before the murder. She never reported this theft. Kenneth had a video surveillance system on his property. 6 days before the murder, the system was deactivated and remained that way. Cindy admitted that she turned it off, although she claimed to be following her husband's instructions. Kenneth always kept the doors to his house locked, yet when the police arrived, all the doors were unlocked. On the night when Kenneth was murdered, none of the foster children were at home, which was unusual. Cindy claimed that she slept in a camper next to the house during the night of the crime and had the windows open. When the police arrived, they noticed that the windows of the camper were closed. The temperature the night before was too hot to comfortably sleep with them closed. One of the reasons that Cindy supposedly slept in the trailer was based on how Kenneth would receive phone calls at night, but the phone records indicated that his phone rarely rang later than 9:30 p.m. or earlier than 7:10 a.m. It is difficult to believe that if the killer was not Cindy or in a conspiracy with Cindy, they would just happen to pick a night where all the circumstances were perfect for the murder. Again, the video surveillance system was off, the doors were unlocked, none of the foster children were at home, and Cindy was in the camper. Cindy claimed that, after discovering the body, She was unable to call from the phone in the bedroom or in the kitchen because those phones were making a screaming sound. The police discovered that the phone in the garage was off the hook. A representative from the phone company said that once the garage phone was taken off the hook, it would have emitted a dial tone for 15 seconds, played a recorded message, then emitted an off-hook signal for 45 seconds. Presumably, this was the screaming sound Cindy heard. The latest that Kenneth was murdered was at midnight. Cindy discovered his body after 8 a.m. There is no way the phones were making that noise 8 hours later. DNA was found on the note, which was near Kenneth's body. This is the note that had the knife through it, and the knife was in the pillow. The DNA ruled out other potential suspects, but it did not rule out Cindy. In one interview, Cindy claimed that Kenneth was still breathing when she found him, but she never performed CPR. Cindy had a motive to commit the murder in the form of a financial benefit. Kenneth had $973,000 in life insurance and lived in a $350,000 house. Furthermore, he owned an 80-acre property in the town of Norrie. Cindy sold that property within 3 weeks of his death for $200,000. A handwriting expert claimed that the signature from Kenneth on his will was probably forged. Both the attorney and the witness whose names were on the will said they were not involved in creating it. Moving to the exculpatory factors, there is no physical evidence tying Cindy to the murder. The weapon used in the killing was never recovered. Anybody could have entered the house and killed Kenneth. He was worried about his safety, which is why he had the video surveillance system installed on his property. For years after the murder, Cindy stayed in regular contact with law enforcement and participated in multiple interviews. She never asked for an attorney, and she was always happy to talk. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I believe that Cindy was guilty of murder? Yes, I am convinced beyond a reasonable doubt she was guilty. I don't think the state's case was great, but it was good enough. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Cindy was self-centered, impulsive, irresponsible, reckless, cold, callous, materialistic, greedy, opportunistic, short-sighted, deceptive, remorseless, had poor critical thinking skills, and had a sense of entitlement. Her relationship with Kenneth was unfulfilling, and she did not value him. Kenneth may have been in a challenging place as far as his mood. For example, he had not talked to any of his children in at least a year, and he consumed excessive quantities of alcohol. When his body was discovered, his blood alcohol concentration was 0.192%. The limit for driving in Wisconsin is 0.08%. Cindy decided to kill Kenneth for his money. She used her shotgun to carry out the murder. She disposed of the shotgun after the killing in a place where it was never found. It's also possible that Cindy had a conspirator, but she did not require one. Cindy managed to carry out the crime without leaving much evidence connecting her to it. Furthermore, there was that bizarre false confession implicating 5 men as the killers. This was a stroke of luck for Cindy. It offered what seemed like a plausible alternate theory of the crime. Cindy could have escaped justice. However, she made the mistake of talking to the police. Without her statements, the investigation would have lost many inculpatory factors. For example, her false statement about the phones, her inconsistent stories about the shotgun, her admission that she turned off the video surveillance system, her false claim about the camper windows, and her dubious assertion about her husband's phone ringing at night. Cindy talked herself into a conviction. At her sentencing, she said her life sentence hurt her soul, and she prefaced many of her statements with the phrase, "as an innocent person." Little did she know that in her final moments, a lot more would be hurting than her soul. The court had punished her with life in prison, but a psychotic cellmate had something more lethal in mind. Those are my thoughts on the case of Kenneth Juedes and Cindy Schulz-Juedes. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. In many of the cases that I've covered, there is this theme of offenders talking to the police. It often plays a large role in them being convicted. This is something that occurs so frequently that it's really stunning. Like, without people talking to the police, there would be very few convictions, at least based on the cases that I've looked at. I think what happens a lot of the time is that offenders are anxious about being convicted and going to prison. So they talk to the police, believing that, figuratively, they are building themselves a ladder to climb out of a hole. But really, they're building their own prison cell. Every word that someone says to a police officer is a word that will be used against them later. At least there's that potential. So when people talk to the police, they are just making their situation much worse. Rarely are there situations where saying something to the police is actually beneficial for the suspect. I guess it can happen some of the time. There are rare situations, but the vast majority of the time, it's very harmful. It just helps the police build a case and put an offender in prison. Again, I think it's rooted most of the time in anxiety. People are trying to solve the problem that they just created for themselves when they committed the crime. They just can't wait. They just can't be calm and give it some time and get a lawyer. They have to immediately talk to the police in an effort to get that relief. In the end, they don't get the relief. They get much more pain. In the case of Cindy Schulz-Juedes, she had this kind of strange attitude about the murder. She didn't seem particularly concerned about catching the killer, but she kept on contacting the police over the years as if to get updates. I think she was trying to make sure that they weren't looking at her. And really, she had some reasons to believe they weren't. I mean, they waited years and years to do anything with this case. Again, the evidence really didn't change much. This was just a matter of the right detective being assigned to the case and moving it forward. So she was keeping an eye on things. There is no statute of limitations on murder, and I think maybe the anxiety was getting the best of her, so she was checking in, hoping that if there was new information that pointed toward her, the police would tell her about it. But the police rarely make the same mistake as a suspect would. They don't talk to suspects about information related to the case. They keep them in the dark. It's the suspects that reveal information to the police. So Cindy really hurt herself in this case. I think there was reasonable doubt if she had not made any statements. If she said nothing, I think she probably could have avoided a conviction. Her chances of escaping responsibility would have increased even more if she had simply called 911 from a house phone or her cell phone. Going to a neighbor's house and then going to another neighbor's house, that just created suspicion right off the bat. So with no statements, again, I think she would have not been convicted. It was her words that kind of pushed this case over the edge into the area of guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. As I've said before in many videos, the same characteristics that facilitate somebody committing murder facilitate them getting caught. So Cindy had poor critical thinking skills. This contributed to her decision to kill her husband and contributed to all the mistakes she made afterward that resulted in her conviction. Just a reminder that I have over 300 pre-release videos on my Patreon account. When I put a video in pre-release status, it stays that way for months, if not a year. The pre-release videos are of the same quality as the videos that I release to the public. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video.